Hi everyone, this is Sagar Shah and I'm currently in Nagpur covering the Maharashtra matches between Vidit and Swidler and Raunak Sadhwani versus Nigel Short. Now, while I have been busy doing that here, Amruta has been commentating live for hours on end on the Norway Chess and she's doing a wonderful job. So I told Amruta on one of the days that why don't you make game recaps as well? Because you've been commentating, you know the games, so it could be an idea to do the game recaps. She was apprehensive at first because she had never done it, but she did it for the first time today, and that was because Gukesh took on Magnus Carlsen and it was a big game. So there was a classical game and then also an Armageddon game, and Amruta has analyzed both of them. It's her first attempt, so I would greatly appreciate that you support her, encourage her, and that she can get better in this and that she's able to do this regularly. Thank you.
This was the fourth round of Norway Chess Classical 2023, and today Gukesh played with Magnus Carlsen. Gukesh was white. He opened with e4 and it went to Italian. Here Magnus played a5 and continued with bishop d7. Now this is something which he had played with Arjun Erigesi in 2022 September, and he had beaten Arjun here. But in this case, Gukesh develops his knight on a3. Magnus decides to exchange. He is okay with giving double bishop advantage to Gukesh. Gukesh also has an isolated pawn over here, but gets an open file, attacks the b7 point, bishop b5, bishop e6 there, and what an amazing move Gukesh finds. d4 over here, not worrying about bishop a2. And mind you, this is something, a very nice tactic. If bishop a2, rook b2, when you attack the bishop goes back, and you might think, okay, white is winning a piece with d5, but no, here Magnus would have had an amazing defense, and that would be, please take a moment, but that was bishop g4. The whole idea is if you take here, then there is a pin, your rook is on b2. That was the whole point here. Well, anyway, this did not really happen. For d4, what Magnus anyway went for was bishop g4 here, just getting out the bishop over here from the d5 threats. Gukesh once again plays an amazing move. Bishop takes c6 at right time to exchange this minor piece, making this double pawns, making the a5 isolated pawns, and by doing so, he has weakened the e5 point. This is all the forcing calculation sorry for that. The forcing calculation he gets into. D takes e5 right now. Bishop takes f3 was important. If Magnus takes here on e5 directly, then Gukesh would have won the pawn by takes. Not here. Directly over here, taking the pawn on e5, and he wins the pawn. There is a pin there, so you cannot take here. So that was the whole idea. But Magnus has an intermezzo. He first plays bishop f3. Gukesh first also takes the rook on b8, queen b8, and now captures the bishop back. Knight goes back. Magnus takes his knight to d7. If he would take here, then he loses a pawn. So that's not what he goes. He goes knight d7, takes, and right now at this point of time, Gukesh had to still continue with accurate play, which was very hard over here. These are definitely weak pawns, but the knight is planning to jump, the rook is planning to put pressure on these, and these are also very weak here. So what Gukesh did over here was a very natural idea, going queen e2, trying to go queen a6, queen c4, all these ideas later. The right way to continue would have been bishop g3, and you pin this pawn here, so no ideas with d5 would be possible. If you go something like knight c5, which looks really good, you're also going to jump to a4. The point is, this rook jumps in, attacks the d6 pawn, and ties down the rook to its defense to d6. So that was the whole point, and Gukesh had time to improve his position there. So this was not so easy. Also, if Magnus would have gone for bishop g3, knight e5, then the queen goes back to d1, keeps the pressure here, keeps the win. If knight c4, once again attacking the knight. If the knight moves, then you have bishop d6. So if knight takes a3, you have queen d6, and you have to really take care about a3. That's not possible. Queen b5 was only moved to support this guy, but once more you attack the queen, and this would have been the position with a4 which could have reached, and over here Gukesh would have had a slight advantage. Nevertheless, it still stays slightly complicated. What happened in the game was queen e2 was played, rook e8, Magnus immediately jumps on the opportunity to put pressure on e4, bishop g3 is played, and knight goes to f6. Again, very important not to go knight c5 to attack this, because f3 is very cool and calm here. Next move, rook d1, once again putting pressure here. The whole idea of knight f6 was, after f3, this knight jumped to h5, and Magnus finds it very quickly. Knight h5, this bishop is attacked, the threat is takes, and d5 is also in the air. Magnus saves, Gukesh saves the bishop to f2, and Magnus still goes d5. There is a pin down there. Queen a6 takes, knight goes back to f6. Knight's gonna capture here, and Gukesh takes the c6 pawn. Magnus takes the e4 pawn, bishop e3, knight g3. What a nice cool move by Magnus here, attacking this guy there. And if you take here, there is rook e3. So Gukesh goes rook e1, defends the e3 bishop, and at this point Magnus had a very interesting idea. Rook takes e3, queen b1 check, king must go to f2, and knight h1 check, and this would have led to a draw with check, king f3, queen f5 check, and a perpetual over here. If king f1, if king f1, there is queen f2 mate, but if king e1, queen f2, king d1, then queen e3, and at this point it would be Gukesh who would have had to give perpetual with queen c8 and queen f5. You cannot play g6. I mean, it's still checks there. Okay, so going back, this did not happen in the game. Magnus did not go for a simplified draw. He went rook e6, queen d5, and queen e8. What a classy move there, putting all the pressure on this e3 bishop. Hg3, finally Gukesh takes the knight, and this goes into queen endgame. And suddenly what happens is Magnus is able to find such a beautiful setup with his pawns and queen, that the queen challenges, and you can never exchange the queen, because it will be a king pawn endgame, lost endgame for Gukesh. So he goes a4, queen e5, and queen c8 check here, queen c2 check. A few checks happen, but Magnus is able to get the king out and start pushing his king side pawns here, once again taking the use, or making the use of queens can't be exchanged so easily. So here g5, now suddenly Magnus starts putting pressure here. It's like the pawn on a2 is not really contributing, and it seems like 3 versus 2. Magnus seems like being a pawn up and pushing it there. King h3, queen e1, a checkmate in 1, king h2, h4. What a move by Magnus, still putting a lot of pressure. Queen h4, king g1, queen e1, king h2. Here they are having, Gukesh is going low on time, g4. Now all these threats with g3, queen h1, queen h2. But Gukesh finds a very good move in 1 minute. With 1 minute in hand, defends the g2 pawn and defends himself against the queen h1 ideas. King goes to g5 and queen b6. Once again, what a move by Gukesh. He finds this, keeping pressure on both these points there. So queen goes to d2. At this point, Magnus had queen c3. A very, very important move he had to find, with the idea of g3 and checkmate if the king goes on the last rank. But also going king h4, because you have just defended your f6 pawn. So what happens next is, he doesn't go queen c3, he goes queen d2, and Gukesh goes queen c5 check. A very, very important check here. King goes back to g6, because if king had gone to h4, then Gukesh would have played queen c7. stopping g3 ideas over there. So that is why Magnus goes king g6, Gukesh goes king g3 once again with 1 minute. The perfect move he finds, brings the king in the towards the pawn there, attacks the pawn. f5 by Magnus, queen e5, queen d3 check, king goes to h2, queen goes to d8, king g3. Gukesh is repeating the moves, thinking that it might end in a draw, but no, Magnus still wants to fight. Queen e4, queen a5, queen f4 check, king goes back, and once again a few checks happened, and g3 by Magnus. Now queen c1 check is a mate there, queen e1 by Gukesh, queen d4 check, king f1, some checks once again, and Magnus tries to bring back his king there. So a5, once again Gukesh is very alert. He cannot move the queen so easily. There are some mating ideas over here. So he goes a5, queen d4 check, king f1, f4 by Magnus. It looks like a pawn race. Gukesh pushes his pawn there. Any other move would bring a lot of trouble with queen d3 check. So he goes a6, queen d3 check anyway, king g1. Now Magnus goes back to h7. If Magnus would have captured the pawn with queen a6 over there, then Gukesh would have simply gone queen d2, attacking the pawn on f4, defending the pawn on a2, also threatening perpetual checks. So Magnus goes back queen h7, Gukesh plays a7, threatening a queen there. So check, takes the pawn on g2, queen goes back, and Gukesh starts attacking these pawns finally. g2, queen takes f4 check, king moves there, and Gukesh starts giving checks here, which ends in a perpetual. So this game ends in a draw, and then it goes to an Armageddon, which in which Gukesh is white.
So once the classical game ends in a draw, in Norway Chess there is this format where you go into an Armageddon game where white gets 10 minutes, black gets 7 minutes, and black also has the draw odds. So Gukesh got the white pieces. He had to win with 10 minutes. Magnus had 7 minutes, and it was an epic game. Let Amruta take over.
Once again, 10 minutes to Gukesh, 7 minutes to Magnus, and they play Italian here as well with slightly different moves later by Magnus. Queen e7, b4, a very standard opening, but here after knight c4 Magnus plays b5, which was not a very good idea by weakening here the a6 pawn, and Gukesh had to retreat knight e3 with the idea of knight d5. Looked very strong, where Magnus would have had to take the knight off from the board, and rook takes e3, and already he has a nice pin over here. d4 is being threatened, so this was important. What happened in the game was Gukesh takes the b5 pawn, a b5, knight a5, and forces the exchange, attacks the b5 pawn, and bravely takes his rook into this cave. What is his idea? g5 by Magnus. Now Magnus could have gone rook b8 with the idea of c6, trapping this rook over here. So why he did not go rook b8? Well, the reason was for d4, c6, he is not happy to give d e5, cb5 here, and ef6 over here. So this would have been great compensation for Gukesh. So Magnus first goes g5, bishop g3, and then goes knight d7 with the idea of c6. But now Gukesh strikes in the center with d4, f6 by Magnus. Once again c6 was not possible because of rook b6, knight b6, and d5, and then you win this pawn. So black king would remain weak. So Magnus goes f6, d takes e5, f takes e5, and c4. What an amazing move by Gukesh. He could have of course tried to escape with rook d5, but he goes c4, c6. He needs to keep the game complicated in order to also have more time with white. He needs to win, so he goes c5, knight d7 by Magnus, takes by Gukesh, and he already has great advantage here. Queen c2, attacks the c6 pawn, rook a6, a bad move by Magnus. The reason is knight e5, Gukesh finds it. The whole idea is if you take here, bishop takes, queen takes, then there is a double check, queen c4, and you win the rook. So what Magnus does his rook a2, and Gukesh could have still gone the same thing, could have waited and not taken, because the rook is still on the diagonal where it will fall in the check of queen c4. Magnus could have also, Gukesh could have also considered a move like queen c4. What he does is, for rook a2, something completely unexpected. He gives a queen sacrifice. Queen takes a2, queen takes a2, knight takes d7, rook d8, knight gives a check on f6, king f7, and now he goes e5. This all looked super dangerous for Magnus, and Gukesh had 5 minutes, Magnus had 3 minutes. Anything could happen still. Magnus finds this move, queen d2, very important move, attacking the rook on e1, f3 by Gukesh. Maybe f4 was very interesting, but in 5 minutes not so easy. f3 takes h3. He now wants a safe place for the king. Here he goes d7, instead of first trying to improve king h2, or maybe even try to maneuver the knight back with knight e4. But here d7, the pawn is tied down, the knight is tied down to the defense of the pawn right now. Check, king h2, king goes to e6, blocks the e6 pawn, rook c1, but he has 2 minutes, Magnus is 1 minute 23 seconds, c5 by Magnus, he goes knight e4, c4 by Magnus, he goes knight d6, again attacks the pawn, c3 by Magnus, he goes knight e4, once more attacks the pawn, king d7, finally he loses an important pawn, rook takes c3, king d8 by Magnus, rook c6, and here Magnus makes a blunder, queen e3. This was the chance for Gukesh. He needed to find e6 right now, and in 52 seconds it was a very tough move to understand why it is winning. So over here e6 was winning, because if Magnus would have tried to enter on the last rank, there was bishop c7 check. The king couldn't have entered a disco, so the king had to get out, but then there was another check. The king again cannot enter a disco, the king goes back, then there is rook c8 mate, and if the king goes back to d8, then there is e7 check, king d7, there is a check. Luckily this guy is defended here. If king e6, then again there is a queen check, and if king e8, then there is rook c8 check, and a check, and a mate there. So that much power had the pawn on e6. Of course, leaving the last rank wouldn't have made sense, so this rook still needed to be on the last rank, but the threats are deadly. Bishop e5, bishop f6, bishop f2, bishop b6, e7, all these threats would have made this position winning for Gukesh. With 52 seconds, he couldn't find it. He goes rook c3, and Magnus is back in the game. Queen d4, rook c2, king e7, rook d2, queen c4, bishop goes to f2, rook a5 attacks the e5 pawn right now, and 8 seconds to Gukesh, 3 seconds to Magnus. Can he beat him on time? Queen c1, bishop d6 check, king e6, king g3, a big blunder, h5. Magnus doesn't take the chance with queen e1 check here. Queen e1 check was the main idea there. If king g4 here, then there is queen h4 mate. That was the point. And if rook goes to f2, then now there is h5 with the idea of h4. So, well, going back to the game, h5 was played by Magnus, knight g5 check, king f5, rook gives a check on d5, but the king has too many places to escape, knight e6, the final blunder, queen e1 check, and loses the knight, resigns the game. But what a fight by Gukesh, what a queen sacrifice, what dynamic play in both the games. In the first game he defended so accurately, he had this beautiful opening, he kept the advantage, he surprised with his moves to Magnus, but eventually the game ended in a draw with very strong defense by Gukesh and some slight errors at 1 or 2 points by Magnus. But in the next game, Gukesh made it as dynamic as he could against the world champion, ex-world champion. But right now it ended in a It ended not so well for him, but a great fight there and a delightful game for us to watch. See you again today for the commentary. Bye bye.
What a game that was, wasn't it? Gukesh came this close to beating Magnus. And this is why Gukesh is an amazing talent. He's just 17 years old and he'll only keep getting better. It was phenomenal. Thank you all for watching this. Please do support it. Please send in your comments. Constructive feedback is always welcome. Trolling is not. And also, if you would like to get a glimpse of how Gukesh thinks, then please do go for Attack with the Super GM like that Gukesh made with us. This is a video course of over 4 hours that was created as the first ever video course by ChessBase India in our Mumbai studio. Gukesh was the first guest and you can watch it, and the link is in the description, so please do take a look.